Hello and welcome to weekly Bible study coming from Carver Memorial Presbyterian Church. I am Dr. Brian Wells, pastor here at the church and your teacher for these instructional times. And we are happy that we are making such good progress through the New Testament. We're just kind of chugging right along through these epistles and writings, many of which have not been given a lot of interpretive attention. And specifically, we're talking about what we normally call the general epistles. Those are those writings that are not connected with the Paul tradition or the gospel tradition in any way, but we are kind of working our way through it. And I think as we start talking about time in relation to that, we will finish 2 Peter tonight. Next Wednesday, we will go on to the book of Jude. I think from there, we will then jump into the book of James. We'll save the book of Hebrews for last in relation to the general epistles because it is the longer piece of all the others. And then we will do Paul last in this New Testament study. And of course, we anticipate going and doing the same thing in the Old Testament. Our idea is to build a biblical foundation that carries us from the book of Genesis through Revelation. Then we can go and do some targeted things that are related to specific themes and issues and challenges. So that's what we foresee for the far-flung future as we continue with our study. So tonight, we invite you to turn to the book of 2 Peter. We ask you to read the last two chapters, and that's chapters 2 and 3. That finishes up the book. Then we also ask that you read True to Our Native Land, pages 491 through 495. So if you've done that, you're ready for tonight's study. So let's go ahead and jump into the book of Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, our overarching theme is dealing with difficulties among the storms of life. And these first three verses deal with destructive missives. Peter is continuing to address himself to internal problems within the church that can undermine its integrity in such a way that it ceases to be the agent of God's mission in the world. So we're always having to work on both of those fronts, making sure that our internal life is efficient and just and focused on the missional call that God has placed on us, and then dealing with those realities that are without, because God calls us to the world. The field is the world. So we are moving beyond the idea of being ingrown. You know, God has not called the church to serve itself. God has called the church to serve the world. So that means being outwardly focused. But we can't be outwardly focused if we're inwardly unhealthy. What happens is we will end up spreading the non-health to the world because we're not embodying the things that we talk about. So it's important that we not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. In these first three verses, he speaks about these false teachers. There were false teachers. He points out that if you know the biblical story, so he clearly is dealing with an audience that knows something about the heritage of the Hebrew Bible, because he keeps pointing to things that came out of the story of the Hebrew Bible as though his audience is familiar with those traditions. It's important in doing Bible study that we not assume anything. So whenever we are dealing with a New Testament book, we must be in the know about the way in which it leans on Old Testament traditions. Quite a bit of that in this chapter of drawing on Old Testament traditions and then on theological traditions that are outside of the Hebrew Bible but have come to find a place in this letter. So one of the things he wants to say to his audience is, first, you shouldn't be surprised that false teachers rise up among you, because if you go back in history to the Hebrew people of old, there were false prophets then as well. So why should we think that we're going to be exempt from dealing with those types of things? This is important for a number of reasons, but we'll just mention a few. When you hear people who are outside of the church talk about why they don't want to be a part of the church, this is one of the things that they lift up. They talk about the problems within the church. Well, they have problems. Well, the reality is you have problems too. Everything that you're a part of socially has problems. The place you work, the home that you live in, the organizations you're a part of. So if an entity being problemless is your prerequisite from being a part of it, then you won't be a part of anything. I mean, the reality is problem solving is an essential art that we have to learn in order to be successful in living life. So let's be fair in our assessment of church in the same way that we try to be fair in our assessment of other entities and organizations. In that sense, the church is just one of many, and because human beings are found in the church, you're going to have issues and problems always. The challenge is how efficient are we at solving problems. That's important. If institutions aren't good at problem solving, then they won't be effective in carrying out their missions. So he warns them. He's basically saying to them, you should expect that there will be false teachers that will rise up from among you. And as he talks about these individuals, he calls them purveyors of destructive ideas. That's what they're warehousing and sharing, ideas that undermine the core teachings of the faith community. We have a core body of teachings and values that are at the heart of being church. And we can't afford the luxury of having those undermined by any one person or persons that has their own agenda. So Peter is addressing himself to these individuals and basically saying that these folks are not helping, they're hurting. So you're going to have to find a way of dealing with that. The false teachings, the destructive teachings. But I want to expand this to not just talk about those doctrinal things, but to talk about any idea that runs counter to the well-being of a community is also going to run counter to the well-being of a church. As churches, we are neighbors within the context of community. So whatever affects the community is going to affect the church. So what's destructive internally for the church is equally destructive externally for the community. The church ought to be a microcosm of what we're striving to make of the communities. Now, this is a different way of looking at church. Too often we have done our work in very isolated ways, cut off from the community, or we either have a growth agenda that's all about us becoming big and wealthy, and not understanding that those things are byproducts of when we have effective missional work within the community. So he wants to remind us that we do have core teachings in the faith community, but the degree to which people are familiar with them and strive to embody them is going to determine how vulnerable they might be to those individuals that Peter calls false teachers. False teachers are just another example of those who are trying to get over on you at their profit and at your expense. Because these agendas that folks have are related to something they're trying to become profitable in doing. So we should have our interpretive antenna up to always be aware of when those folks are present and to make sure that we are not vulnerable to being exploited by them. We look at our history as a people of color in this land. Exploitation has been one of the primary ways by which others have related to our community. They recognize that our community has tremendous potential, tremendous resources, and more than all that, tremendous talent. And they want to exploit us and our resources. What do I mean by that? Well, people that exploit you use you and your potentials to make them rich and you poor. And that's what exploitation is about. If we just go back into the history of the music industry, for example, yes, there were many individuals that did not look like us that helped us to break into the music-making venues. But what happened? Well, they got more rich than the people that were actually doing all the singing and performing. So in our day, we have come to see people of color getting into production rather than just performance, because that's where the real wealth is to be found, in production. So by doing that, black folks have gotten to the place where their talent is now primarily benefiting them rather than those who exploit them or that put their talent to work in lining their pockets better than the people who actually have the talent. Peter addresses himself to the fact that there are individuals that are internal exploiters, and we've got to make sure that we build communities that shuts that type of thing down, or basically waterproofs our members to the way that they are not susceptible to being co-opted by those types of forces. Communities continue to demonstrate, however, vulnerability to such things. Vulnerability because once you get into this business of being part of a faith community, you have to go on and move to maturity so that you know the things that you need to know, so that you are empowered to the place that you become less vulnerable to being exploited by these powers. So in this chapter, there are themes about destruction. Destruction in relation to self and to others. There are issues of greed and exploitation that are addressed. Notice the language that is used here. He says, concerning them, who secretly bring in destructive opinions. It says, their condemnation pronounced against them long ago has not been idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So whenever we talk about an individual following a path that we see clearly is self-destructive, here's where the accelerated problem comes in. That a teacher is one who attempts to capture the minds and imaginations of others. So if their teaching content is one that leads down a path to destruction, then they are not going to go off the edge of that cliff by themselves. They're going to take with them those who they have influenced to their way of thinking and seeing. Now, some of the worst examples that we've seen of that in history are like the Jim Jones situation in Guyana. Here is a white clergyman who led a group of people down a manipulative path that ultimately brought about their destruction. Now, that's the worst of the worst type of example. But there are other examples that can be equally destructive that may not take life, but may sap all of the quality out of life. So you should always beware of any type of religious leadership or teaching that requires you to sacrifice your intellect to be a part of it, so that you have blind loyalty to someone's leadership who is largely symbol and largely celebrity. And I see so many people going down this path where I do it because our leaders said do it. Well, I'm afraid that's not good enough. Leaders, true leaders, always are going to empower you with the reasons why you should do anything that you do. And they will always say this: this is the direction I am leading, and if you in a clear conscience cannot follow, then they're not going to attempt you to do something that you don't personally believe in. They're going to try to win your understanding and commitment so that your participation in whatever they are calling you to follow you in is intelligent and not ignorant. Unfortunately, you've got a lot of ignorant followership who are committed to a symbol and a celebrity and not to knowledge and understanding. So that's the type of existence to avoid. We want to establish communities that are doing the hard intellectual work that they need to do whatever it is that they believe that God is calling them to do. When we are in the know about why we do what we do, then we are intelligent followers. But if we don't know why or understand what it's all about, but yet we say we're following, then we're following in a very exploitive way that can certainly lead to destruction. I want you to note how many times in this chapter Peter talks about greed. Greed. You see, greed is not after what's essential. Greed wants to control everything and everybody. So it's important that when we look at these types of people today that we understand it's not about need, it's about greed. We are trying to address the needs within this community. We are not interested in the greed component. And this world that we live in is a very greed-driven thing. Most of the economies of our world are greed-driven economies. So Mahatma Gandhi's saying here is very important. Our non-cooperation is with the system the English have established in India, with the material civilization and its attendant greed and exploitation of the weak. So when he talked about non-cooperation and resistance, that's what he was talking about too. And we've got to talk about that in the same way. We cannot become part of the landscape of these greed-driven economies. When churches become greed-driven, they are more concerned about profiting off of the community versus serving with the community. We've got to be churches that are committed to that missional thing. In verses 4 through 11, Peter raises the question of theodicy. Theodicy wrestles with the question of how can God be good when there is evil in the world? Now, we affirm God's goodness, but the problem of evil tries to raise this question. If God is so good, then why is there evil in the world? Now, along with this idea of God's goodness is God's power. Now, we would say to an individual that has the power to stop evil, but fails to do it, we would say that's not good. If you have the power to stop evil and you claim to be good, then why don't you stop the evil? This is an issue that is both theological and philosophical, that the greatest minds have wrestled with since the very beginning. When you go to the Old Testament, perhaps one of the oldest books in the Old Testament is the book of Job. Now, when we start talking about the Old Testament, it's just like the New Testament. We have many books, the books in the Old Testament are not arranged in the order that they were written. They are arranged by subject matter. So when we actually go and look at the antiquity of the books that are in the Old Testament, the book of Job is one of the oldest. And what is it about? The book of Job is wrestling with the idea of the goodness of God, in spite of the fact that there is this world over which God reigns that has evil in it. So how do we answer that question? How do we affirm God's goodness in realistic ways and explain the evil that's operative in the world that God made? Peter tries to answer that, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to merely talk about the ways that this book tries to answer the question. Drawing on the language largely from the book of Jude, Peter uses some Old Testament stories with two themes that they have that are in common. The first of those themes is this: the unrighteous will not escape God's justice. One of the things that the false teachers were saying, they were rejecting the idea of the return of the Lord based on a faulty understanding of history. They're saying, well, where is this promise of the coming? Because ever since the world began, it's continued as it is without any change. Well, we know that that's not true. Drawing upon a couple of stopping points, Peter challenges that notion that the world that we're in has just kind of been moving along in an even way without any change. He talks about some radical crises that took place. The first of which he draws on is the Noah situation. He says that world was a very different world than the one we presently have. And God destroyed that world. Says that we go back and read the tradition of the great flood. What's amazing is when you go into about every great ancient civilization, they all in some way talk about a great flood that happened. So in this sense, the Old Testament is really resonating what all the ancient societies did, that there was a great flood. Now, Genesis says that God brought that great flood of waters on the earth because the earth and the people on it had moved so far away from what God wanted. And that's one of the components that complicates this conversation. God gave us freedom to choose. So when we're following God, we're not following God because we've been programmed to do that. We're doing it because we have chosen to do that. That's the type of world that God wanted to create, a world in which people could choose. But wherever there's choice, there must also be responsibility for the choices that we make. So God basically said, the world has made such extraordinarily bad choices that the only way to go from here is to wipe it out and start over. So Genesis really has a couple of creation traditions. There is the creation tradition that begins all things, but then there is a recreation tradition that comes in with the flood. God takes everything away and goes back to the drawing board with another group of human beings. He started with a small group of human beings in a garden, and now he's starting with another small group of human beings on the other side of the flood. So then, what that basically means is that, no, the world has not just continued on a lateral line without any significant changes. And now, Peter goes on to say this. He points to this and says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of the deepest darkness, to be kept unto the judgment." So the judgment stands as one of the responses to the evil that is in the world today. God is going to hold all people accountable for what they do with the freedom that God gave them. But once you give people freedom to choose, then you have to deal with the complexities of the choices that they make. So this is kind of the first way that he answers it. He basically says this: nobody is going to get away. Even though in our global systems, people often get away from being dealt with in just, equitable ways. Individuals that should be dealt with don't get dealt with. Individuals who should be held accountable don't get held accountable. So the way that God counterbalances this is with the idea of judgment. And that judgment can come in divine actions that precede the great judgment day. And so we can kind of see this. We see the flood was a judgment. The dealing with the fallen angels was a judgment. He goes on and says that in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, when they were wicked and unjust, God judged them. So each of these actions is demonstrative of the way that the good God deals with the evil that is in the world by the choices that people make. That's how evil came into the world, is through human choices. That's why evil is in the world, because people want to systematically choose the wrong thing that's inconsistent with what God wills. But judgment is how God has historically dealt with the issue of the good and the evil. So God can be affirmed in God's goodness, and people can be affirmed in their choices, whether good or evil. Peter's going to say a little bit more about this as we get on, but there is a saying that Dr. King used to quote frequently, that the moral arc of the universe bends long, but it bends towards justice. We're going to come back to that in a minute, because one of the other things that he's going to use to counterbalance this is the long-suffering or the patience of God. Because our good and bad choices are often linked to developmental processes, we often need time to mature so that we can learn how to choose the right thing over the wrong thing. Now, as we push on further into this chapter, in verses 12 through 16, we have the shelter from the storm. Peter offers a scathing critique of the false teachers, and he attempts to unmask their true motives. He wants to say that their hearts aren't right, and so what they do is not coming out of the proper kind of motivation. We can understand that. The question of why do people do what they do? It's a question of motivation. Is that motivation good? Is that motivation sound? Or is that motivation flawed? Is that motivation beset with personal, self-aggrandizing agendas? So Peter offers this critique, and we've got to be this way too. We've got to always be critical of everything that happens. And by critical, I don't mean negative. Those are two different things. We all know people that are just negative. Anything that happens, they're always going to see the downside of it. They're just by nature negative. But when we start talking about being critical thinkers, we are basically saying that we have a responsibility to understand anything that that's asked of us. We need to understand why things are the way they are, and what does it mean to participate responsibly. Being critical is this idea that we're not going to sacrifice our intellect to just be a part of something. But we've always got to be on the know there, because when we sacrifice the intellect, that's when we become vulnerable for those who want to exploit us. And we've had enough of that. So Peter emphasizes the fact that these individuals are greedy, that they are arrogant, that they are willful, and that they are materialistic. Kind of sounds like American capitalism. But when we look at this, he is calling them out and calling them exactly what they are, basically saying that their hearts are not in the right place. once more, he draws on one of the Old Testament narratives to illustrate this. He draws on the story of Balaam the prophet and the nation of Israel. If we remember the story, Balak tried to get the prophet Balaam to put a prophetic curse on Israel. The ancients believed that if a prophet put a curse on a people, that God would honor the curse. And so he gets Balaam and says to Balaam, I want you to go and curse the Israelites. And Balaam accepts the money and goes to do that. In the process of going, he's riding this donkey. This is really an interesting story from the Old Testament. He's riding this donkey on his way to curse the people of Israel. In the road ahead of him, he does not see that the angel of the Lord is standing there with a drawn sword, because he is not going to allow this prophet to go and curse the people of Israel. The donkey that he's riding sees the angel and stops in his track. And Balaam is so irritated with this animal that won't move, because as we know, donkeys and mules can be a little stubborn in the attitude area. So he begins to hit the animal with his stick. And this is a strange story, because it says the donkey turns and speaks to him, in a human voice, and saying, I've been a good animal. Why would you be beating on me? And if you would open your eyes enough, you would see that this angel is about to take you down, and if I hadn't stopped, he would have done it. Now, this is interesting, because basically, in the time of Balaam, it was a rare thing for a jackass to speak. But in the times that we live, it's a rare thing for them to be quiet. So it's important, I think, for us to see exactly what Peter is talking about, because what? Balaam is a prophet for profit. P-R-O-F-I-T. These are individuals who have misused the gift that God has given them. They have forgotten about the origin of the gift and have begun to use the gift for their own selfish gain. Balaam went on to Israel after this encounter, but every time he opened his mouth to try to curse Israel, God put words of blessing in his mouth. So that, there was a disconnect between the mouth and the brain. He was trying to curse Israel, but every time the words would come out, they were blessings. So don't worry in your own life about those individuals who seem to be in your life to only be a source of curse, because God has a way of not allowing the words and what they want to do to become fruitful. But God has a way of turning the madness that they're trying to do to you into a source of blessing. The story is told of a black woman who lived next door to a white lady that hated black people. And there was a fence in their backyard that separated their two backyards. And this white lady had these dogs. And every day she would go out there and scoop up their excrement with shovels and throw it into the yard of that black woman. But here's what happened. The white lady became terribly ill and sick and was hospitalized and was almost at the point of death. And as she was in the hospital, guess what happened? The black lady who lived next door came to visit her at the hospital, brought her a beautiful card, and brought her bags filled with fresh vegetables and fruit. And the woman was taken back. He says that all the bad that I do to you, and you're going to turn around and do nothing but good, and especially this good here. And the black woman said this. He says, well, I just know that God works in a mysterious way. Because I would see you every day out there scooping that excrement up and throwing it over into my backyard. But what you didn't realize is that all that excrement was landing in my vegetable garden and fertilized these fine fruits and vegetables that I'm bringing you today. So God has a way to take the excrement that people throw your way and to use it to fertilize your life and create growth in spite of the evil that folks wanted to do to you. That's what the Balaam story is like. Now, as we push on in this chapter, 2 Peter verses 17 through 22 of the second chapter, we have this smaller sub-theme of empty promises of freedom. He challenged his listeners to beware of the false teachings in both church and community, and that these false teachers are people that somehow and somewhere they lost their way ethically. And unfortunately, false teachers don't tend to ever go down the path to destruction by themselves. They're always taking people with them. He challenges his people to understand this. He says that these individuals are promising you all kinds of things. They promise an idea of freedom, but it is actually an empty promise that ends up leading to new forms of slavery. We understand this in the whole field of addictions, that when you are trying to break the cycle of an addiction, they can take you into these places and they can get you clean overnight. But the challenge is not getting clean, it's staying clean. Because what happens? They understand this. If you're an addict and we get you clean, but then you turn right around and go back to all your addict and drug-using friends, then they're going to get you back into the same mess that we worked to get you out of. So what they teach is this. You've got to now recognize that you have a responsibility to only include people in your life that are supportive of your recovery. And individuals that are users, for whatever reasons, and however nice they may be, are not supportive of your recovery. So that's why you've got to burn those bridges and then start building bridges to people that are supportive of your recovery. And they're already in your life. There are all kinds of people in your life who are constantly saying to you, you have to break the hold that this substance has in your life so that you can be the one that's in charge of your life again, and you have not yielded your freedom over to the substance. So you have people already in your life that are supportive of your recovery. You've got to get those people out of your life who are not supportive of your recovery. So there are times in our life when we have to start writing folk pink slips to get them out of our life so that we can begin to rebuild by including the type of people in our lives that believe in the importance of where we're trying to get. I had a young man in the community just a few weeks ago who's a business owner who was talking to me about wanting to get his life back together again. And I know what he's saying, because there are so many ways that our lives can become derailed by things, by people, and by situations that are not constructive, good, or wholesome. And we've got to make the determination to take charge of our lives in ways that our lives can once more be under our responsible control, and so that they are able to achieve the legitimate choices that we're making. So that's what Peter is trying to get his audience to see. Don't hand your freedom to these false teachers, because they're making you all kinds of promises. But the question is, can they deliver on those promises? We understand that. Whenever the election time comes up, we don't even have to see the calendar, because we all of a sudden start seeing people that don't look like us coming to our neighborhoods, making us all kinds of promises if we will vote for them. But the question and reality is this. It's not how many promises you can make, but how many promises can you keep? That's the true crux of the matter. So we are optimistic that our new president is going to keep the promises that he has made. Now, so far, he's been doing a pretty good job, but we've still got a long way to go. And it's important that individuals only promise the things that they can deliver on. And so we feel that these times that we're in, that a lot of these promises can be delivered, but it's just important that we get follow through with this, because our memory is going to be long in relation to this. So, Mr. Biden, you've made a lot of promises, but we need you to keep the promises that you've made. He talks about them as they are masters at peddling products that lead to bondage rather than emancipation. He says that's the way these false teachers are. So he is critiquing them. Now, of course, there's not space in here for these individuals to answer him. So it's a pretty one-sided conversation, which is always what we get when somebody writes a letter. And this letter is painting a pretty bleak picture of these individuals. The reality is, however, that the picture that he is painting is one that we often see in varying social settings. So just be clear on this. Whatever you are vesting your time, energy, and resources in, make sure that you're doing it because of good reasons and not just the charisma of those who invite you, because that's going to be the real crux of the matter. Clearly, Peter is trying to challenge people to not be naive, to not be susceptible, and to not allow these individuals, after Christ has come and emancipated you, he's saying, don't let anybody lead you back into bondage. In that sense, the New Testament writers are all on the same page. Paul says this almost the same way. Peter says this in this way. So we get a remarkable amount of continuity how the writers of Scripture want to challenge us to be careful about not losing the freedom that Christ has provided for us. Now, as we push on into this third chapter, the overarching theme is a doxology to exhale. In these first 7 verses addresses the idea of substance over shadows. Peter talks about the parousia. Parousia is the Greek word that is used to talk about the second coming of Christ. So you'll see me use that word a lot. The idea in the parousia is that, number one, we clearly understand in light of the already and the not yet, that God still has an unfinished agenda to accomplish in relation to creation. But the second thing is this. When the New Testament writers use that term parousia, they use it in a very specific way. They're talking about those things that can only be done and accomplished by God's personal presence. Wow. So if we get the idea of the first coming parousia, we talk about in the gospel message that God became man in Jesus. So what does that mean? That God sat and looked at this thing and said, look, this thing that I'm trying to accomplish here, I can only accomplish it by being there, personally present. So once more again, the writers are taking up this idea about that which can only be accomplished by God being personally present. Now, we struggle to understand what the shape of that personal presence will be. The book of Acts said, this same Jesus who you see taken up shall come in a like way. Question, though, is, what does like mean? Singular. But what is the shape of the similarity that that coming will take? There is a warning. The warning that we give is this. Many of the leaders of Israel missed out in recognizing the coming of God in Jesus Christ because they had in their minds that the thing that God was coming to do could only be done in one way. And when Jesus shows up in a way that's other than that one way that they thought, they reject him on the basis of their own opinion. We should be careful that as we stand on the threshold of this parousia of coming again, that we not have so worked out in our mind a specific way that it's got to happen that we don't miss out on it like those in the first century did. Okay? Now, there are a lot of ideas about the end of history. And some of these ideas are very stylish and Hollywood looking, but others are very simple and related to things that God can do through history. How will it happen? The reality is this: we don't know how it will happen. So when you don't know how a thing will happen, there's no place for being dogmatic in the shape that it takes. This means this, that we have to be open and tolerant to a lot of different ways of thinking about how it can happen so that we don't miss out on the great thing that God's going to do when it does happen. He talks about the judgment in this chapter. The judgment is the affirmation that ultimately God's justice will be served. We know all kinds of people who beat the systems because the systems are many times designed poorly. They favor certain racial groups over others. And so there are systems that are flawed and are broken and don't work correctly. But God's justice will always work correctly. So the judgment really is a theological necessity in light of the question about evil in the world. Because if the world itself is evil, then we know that many of its outcomes in relation to certain things will be flawed as well. The judgment of God is the balancing agent that helps us to affirm God's goodness because we know that no guilty person will ultimately get off. They may beat these courts and systems that we've put together, but they won't beat the system of the heavenly courtroom. False teachers forget that creation has not continued and will not continue without significant divine crises. The first and foremost was a crisis of water that wiped out one world system and opened the door for the creation of another one. The New Testament writers and the prophets say that it was water then, but it'll be the fire next time. So that powerful metaphor that is used is descriptive of the fact that once more God will bring a great crisis that wipes out a broken world system so that a new one might emerge in which there is justice and peace. So it'll be the fire next time, just like in the James Baldwin book. But finally, there is an eschatological warning in verses 8 through 13. Early Christian interpretation responded to these critics of the second coming by saying, they were out there saying, we keep hearing about this second coming. Well, when is it going to be? So they had come to the conclusion that there is no second coming, that the world is going to go on just like it is going on indefinitely. Peter counters that and says this: the reason why the coming hasn't happened is not because it's not going to happen. It's because God has a valid reason for delaying it. Now, we live in a world where we often hear the saying, justice delayed is justice denied. But when we get into analyzing that statement, those who are delaying the justice don't want to give you the justice. That's why they're delaying it. But when we talk about God's justice being delayed, there are reasons why God delays the justice. A number of ideas come out of this in this revised understanding of the delayed coming. First of all, that to God, time is irrelevant. You and I are bound by time and space. Everything that we have in mind to do or be is limited to what can happen in time and space. But God lives both in time and outside of time, so that a day to him is no different than 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is no different than a day. When you're eternal, time is irrelevant. But when you are mortal, time and space are extremely relevant, because we know we only have so much time and so much space in which to make everything happen that we have in mind to happen. So part of the delay is because time is not the important factor in God's process. But another thing is this, is God is a promise keeper. So God never makes promises that God doesn't deliver on. That's what makes God different from politicians. God is always going to deliver on a promise. And every promise that God makes, God keeps. So if God makes a promise that there will be a return, we can rest assured there will be a return. But third and final is this. Any delay creates time for somebody. Because if the return is delayed, in which we know that there will be a great accounting and a great judgment, then the delay works in favor of those who aren't ready for the coming to happen. So that's patience, that's long-suffering. God is basically saying this, I'm going to give humanity a little more time to get their act together so that they might be ready when I come. The gospel writers are all unanimous in this idea that we've just got to always be ready. If we're not ready, because what? Our Lord is coming in a time that we don't know. So when we don't have something on our schedule to happen at a specific time, I mean, if we knew that it was going to happen at 12 noon on Thursday of this week, we'd be ready when that time rolls around. But since we know that there is no time that has been declared by God as to when this will happen, the wisest way to respond to that is to practice the idea of readiness now. If it can happen at any time, we need to be ready at any time. The gospel writers say there will be a special blessing for those who are ready when their Lord comes. So let's just make sure we're in that group of people who are ready. Creation will be recreated into a new heavens and a new earth that fulfills God's intention from the very beginning. The prophets of old say it. The writers of the New Testament saying, God is the one that says, I make all things new, that I will make a new heaven and a new earth. So if we know that that is a promise that comes from God, then we can bank on that promise. In these final 4 verses of chapter 3, verses 14 through 18, Waiting to Exhale, we know the title we have seen in Terry McMillan's award-winning book, and that whole idea, I think, is something that we can see played out in other scenarios. Patience here is waiting with God rather than for God. God is the one that stands in solidarity with us in all things. So when we talk about God, we have to talk about God in ways of that abiding presence. The teaching on the Holy Spirit indwelling the church is the New Testament's way of saying that God is the one who doesn't have to come running to our rescue, because God is the one that lives and dwells in our midst. So, if we are waiting for something, so is God. If we are being patient for something, so is God. In relation to us, it's for God to fulfill his promise fully by taking care of those not yet things. In relation to God, the patience is found in putting up with people until the opportune time comes to bring about those realities. Both are dimensions of patience, even though the target and goal is slightly different. So in the interim, Peter calls upon his audience to be productive and not destructive. So we say not destructive, he is really talking about them breaking with those individuals who are purveyors of false things that will destroy the community, but he challenges them to be productive in the language of grow in grace and knowledge. Growing in grace is growing in God's favor, but growing in knowledge is coming to understand and know more so that we're living our lives based on knowledge and not ignorance. He makes reference to Paul's writings and talks about how Paul also talks about the return. But this waiting to exhale thing is a strong theme in the Terry McMillan book, In the Experience of Black Women. It's basically lifting up this idea that to be a black woman in America and on planet Earth is to always be in a waiting cycle. So that wait is like waiting to exhale. You've been holding your breath all this time, waiting for the world to acknowledge your value as a woman and your value as a black person. And acknowledging that means responding to you in ways that declare your value. In what ways? By paying you equally for the same job that you do that a man does, in which you have just as many qualifications but are underpaid merely because you're a woman. It means living the equity of the American promises about freedom that have been promised and promised and promised to us, but never ever fully delivered. Holding your breath, waiting to be able to exhale when those things happen. Well, I'm afraid we're all still holding our breath. Racism has us in those two cycles. We're either holding our breath, waiting on the right thing to happen, or we're unable to breathe because the society has its full weight on our back and on our necks. Powerful metaphors here. But I think if I were Peter, I would say this: don't hold your breath waiting on other folks to do the right thing, but use your breath to give your own self the strength and the motivation to do for yourselves what you need to do in order to fulfill what God has called us to be about. We need to hold others accountable as well, but we need to recognize that we are the primary persons responsible for our own ascendancy. Because if we're waiting on somebody else to write our ticket to freedom, that's why we stand around waiting to exhale or under the pressure of the society not being able to breathe. Well, I have two discussion questions for you that lead into our Thursday interactive study tomorrow. The first is, discuss one thing that makes faith communities vulnerable to error doctrinally and politically. So this rises right out of the conversation that Peter is having. Secondly, why is belief in the judgment day an essential truth? So you can respond to both or either of those questions and to bring your responses to tomorrow's interactive study at 7. And we'll be glad to have those conversations then. If you don't have the link for the Zoom meeting, then email me at carverpastor@gmail.com, and I'll see that that link gets out to you. But we look to see you tomorrow night at 7 as we have our last discussion on the book of 2 Peter. And for the coming week of next Wednesday, please read the little book of Jude, which is right before the book of Revelation, and read True to Our Native Land, pages 518 through 522, and you'll be ready for next week's streamed Bible study. And after Jude, we'll be going on to James and then to the book of Hebrews, and that will wrap up our work with the general epistles. So we hope you'll join us tomorrow night at 7 and next week for the book of Jude. As always, in these times of pandemic, we encourage you to get vaccinated and to continue to practice use of your mask, social distancing, sanitizing your hands frequently. If we keep on doing these little things, we will make progress into getting to a new kind of norm and get beyond this pandemic. So our prayer for you is that you will be blessed and be safe, and this comes from the good people at Carver Memorial Presbyterian Church. God bless you, and we will see you soon.